At the lowest time in Joseph's life, lost and forgotten, far from his father's house in a dark dungeon, Joseph was numbered with the transgressors. He has placed next to him two unnamed men charged with unspecified crimes. For one, Joseph will predict forgiveness of past sins and a restoration to glory. The other, only pitiable death and hopelessness. As Jesus hung on the cross, separated from his Father, the sky turned dark. Placed next to him were two unnamed criminals. Jesus, like Joseph, was numbered with the transgressors. To the one, he promised forgiveness of sins and entry into paradise. The other faced only a pitiable death and eternal hopelessness. At the conclusion of the last chapter, we have the similarities between Joseph and Jesus continuing. Potiphar, a powerful man of the ruling class of people, punished innocent Joseph to placate irrational anger, just as Pilate, a powerful man of the ruling class of people, punished innocent Jesus to placate irrational anger. Joseph won the good favour and respect of his Gentile chief guardsman. The Gentile centurion at the crucifixion declared of Jesus, "Surely this was a righteous man, and truly this was the Son of God." Connected by contrast, Potiphar was strong-armed to comply with the will of his wife, whereas Pilate was strong-armed to act contrary to the will of his wife. Genesis 40 verse 1. And it came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while. At the lowest time in Joseph's life, lost and forgotten, far from his father's house in a dark dungeon, Joseph was numbered with the transgressors. He has placed next to him two unnamed men charged with unspecified crimes. For one, Joseph will predict forgiveness of past sins and a restoration to glory. The other, only pitiable death and hopelessness. As Jesus hung on the cross, separated from his Father, the sky turned dark. Placed next to him were two unnamed criminals. Jesus, like Joseph, was numbered with the transgressors. To the one, he promised forgiveness of sins and entry into paradise. The other faced only a pitiable death and eternal hopelessness. Verse 5. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning, and looked at them, and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" For us, a position as butler or baker doesn't sound all that impressive. But to be the butler or baker of Pharaoh, these were two of the elite positions in the empire. These were high officials, trusted men very close to the monarch. The captain of the prison guard charged Joseph with looking after these two officers of Pharaoh. If one or both were to return to their former position and they were treated badly in prison, they could return terrible retribution upon the head of the captain of the guards. That's why Joseph is charged in verse 4 with serving them, seeing to their needs. Make sure you treat them as well as possible. Give them the best available food and bedding. Speak kindly to them. Be a shoulder for them to cry on if needed. Clearly the hand of God is involved in these dreams, both occurring on the same night. Both men understanding the dreams were prophetic. But what chance was there a wise man, a dream interpreter, would be at hand to assist them in this terrible dungeon? Both officers were sad. The Hebrew word zaraph. They were fretting, vexed, out of humour, perplexed, troubled. Joseph's been told to keep them in good humour, comfort them, look after them. So Joseph has good reason to diagnose their despondency. It also just so happens Joseph was the greatest dream interpreter on the planet. Amazing how the unseen hand of God saw to it that Joseph was their prison attendant. Verse 8. And they said to him, We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. So Joseph said to them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. The humility of Joseph now is clear. No longer that 17-year-old boy strutting around the farmlands in his uppity special tunic, his $10,000 Armani suit. No longer bragging to his family about his dreams, predicting their bowing before him. Nothing works better to rid a person of pride than a period of tough times. Since being Daddy's favourite, spoilt and privileged teenage son, he's been cast into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused of rape, cast into a dark dungeon, now likely for years, seemingly without hope of escape. Any hint of pride now completely removed from Joseph's life. Joseph, the greatest dream interpreter alive, now humbly declares, This alone is the domain of God. Tell the dreams to me, please. I will inquire of God the interpretation on your behalf. Verse 9. Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. You can almost guarantee the 2 imprisoned officials had discussed their dreams with each other. They would have noticed both the similarities and the differences. Both of their dreams occurred on the same night. Surely no coincidence. Evidence of divine intervention. In both dreams, the number 3 was prominent. Both dreams directly link back to their official royal duties. Both their dreams related to Pharaoh. Both dreams involved a body part. The butler's dream, his hand. The baker's dream, his head. In this dream, the anticipation of Pharaoh drinking of the butler's wine prepared for Pharaoh. In the baker's dream, no anticipation. The birds did eat, bread prepared for Pharaoh. It's no surprise the butler tells his dream first. It clearly has a more optimistic, hopeful feel to it. Verse 12. And Joseph said to him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed, I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews. And also, I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. The similitudes between Joseph and Jesus continue. The number 3 is central to these prophetic dreams. They're in a dark place of hopeless despondency, as close to death as the living could get in Egypt. And Joseph predicts 3 days' time, effective life from the dead for the butler. When the religious Jews asked Jesus for a prophetic sign, he referred them to the sign of Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights, the length of Jesus' stay in the domain of the underworld dead. This was uplifting, blessed news. The butler to be restored. Joseph's personal plea. Only, please remember me. Joseph, the one who looked after you in prison, the interpreter of your dream, the man who gave you hope for a brighter tomorrow. Joseph asked to be remembered. Remember me. The same words uttered by the criminal on the cross next to Jesus. Or Jesus' words the night he was betrayed. This is my body, speaking of the bread, which is given for you. Do this and eat this in remembrance of me. Also, don't miss that Joseph mentions his Hebrew roots once again, hinting to us Joseph believed this would be favourably viewed by Pharaoh. Further evidence, Pharaoh was possibly a Semite, not a native Egyptian. Verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. You can't help but feel for the baker. He waited for the first interpretation, knowing in his gut his dreams seemed bleaker than the butler's. Hearing the good first interpretation, he has a short-lived moment of hope. His dream retelling, less descriptive, almost told in summary form, keeping the descriptions to a minimum. When you look through the Bible, when birds are mentioned, if there's symbolic undertones, it's usually bad news, especially in relation to prophecy. Think of the Zechariah 5 women with stork-like wings, carrying the basket of wickedness, or the Revelation 19 birds called to feast on the judged dead, or the birds, speaking of the instruments of Satan in the Gospels, plucking away the seed from the pathway, or the birds nesting in the branches of the overgrown, defiled mustard tree. Be sure to apply the principle of expositional constancy when you read and interpret Scripture. Verse 18, so Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Joseph is no pleaser of men. He reveals God's interpretation without editing, without censorship. Joseph was the type of guy who quickly ripped off the Band-Aid. He gave it to the baker hard, direct, and straight. You've got 3 days to prepare to meet your maker. Maybe Joseph spent those 3 days telling the baker about Yahweh. Before the baker would hang on the tree, maybe Joseph introduced him to the maker of the trees. The Bible doesn't give any details, but wouldn't it be wonderful to meet this baker one day in eternity, to find out in his final 3 days, having previously lived his life worshipping false gods. Maybe he spent his final 3 days bowed before the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He will die the death of the cursed, hung on a tree. Does that remind you of anyone? Verse 20. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. So we're given this little additional detail in these closing verses. The 3rd day coincided with Pharaoh's birthday, a day of feasting and celebration amongst the elites of Egypt. Now, taking a final review of the 2 dreams before moving on, did you notice the prominence of the 2 elements in these 2 heavenly dreams? Bread and wine. Does that catch your attention? This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for the remission of sins. And for the record, the butler mentions cup on 3 occasions. In the Passover Seder, the 3rd cup is the cup of blessing, the one we remember as part of the Lord's Supper. Of interest, there are 4 cups drunk in the Passover meal. Joseph mentions the 4th and final cup in his interpretation of the dream. These specific details are intriguing. Is this coincidental, or is it written this way by design of the Holy Spirit? I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And of course, the prophet of God, Joseph, had given 100% accurate predictions to the butler and the baker. You'd have thought the butler would have quickly revealed the details of Joseph to Pharaoh. But the butler shows a tendency common to most men, a me-first attitude. I've just been delivered from jail. Best to be cautious with the things I share before Pharaoh. Maybe it was something he'd innocently blurted out previously that had caused offence before Pharaoh. Or maybe he was just so happy he was free, elevated back to the top of Egypt. Why bother involving himself with the concerns of a lowly dungeon dweller? It's Pharaoh's birthday celebrations. The butler had more important things to concern himself with than to worry about some Hebrew. So poor Joseph was quickly forgotten and sadly left to rot for 2 more years in that dark dungeon. Until our next study, may God richly bless you all.